Welcome to our first colloquium of 2014 on scholarly communications. Today we are pleased to welcome Kathleen Fitzpatrick, the Director of Scholarly Communications of the Modern Language Association and Professor of Media Studies, on leave, at Pomona College, and the visiting Research Professor of English at NYU. She is the author of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, published in 2011 by NYU Press, and previously made available for open peer review online, and The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American Novel in the Age of Television, published in 2006 by Vanderbilt University Press. She's also the co-founder of the digital scholarly network Media Commons, where she has led, not left, a number of experiments in open peer review and other innovations in scholarly publishing. Today's presentation is one that speaks deeply to this particular institution because we're looking at the intersection of humanities scholarship and digital publishing, digital archiving, digital preservation, and that intersection, those two intersections, again with open peer review. We're delighted you're here and that you made that trip down from New York to be able to talk to us about this and about your experience. I know that Linnea has asked that we leave time at the end for conversation, and we're deliberately in this small room because it facilitates conversation.
Good.
Kathleen, we're delighted to have you here. Please come.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for coming out on a cold morning. I know your term is just getting started, and with the snow and everything, it kind of, I don't know, it has things a little discombobulated, but I'm hoping to recombobulate as we go. A couple of little things that I should mention before I start, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Sadly, the middle term of my title as presented to you is actually no longer the case. I had to leave my on-leaveness at Pomona College at the end of last academic year, so I have now no longer that affiliation. But I spent 13 fabulous years there, and it was wonderful to spend those particularly formative years of my career at an institution that was so dedicated to the liberal arts and to the liberal arts in a very traditional sense. So I come from a program that was really attempting to think about the place of new forms of media within that very traditional environment, and that informs a whole lot of what's going on in this talk. What I'm going to be talking about today has to do with some issues that are circulating in the digital humanities. And I never know when I start the digital humanities talk where everybody is with respect to the field, how much you have been involved in what's going on in it, how much you've read, how much it seems like a sort of black box as yet. And so I'm going to start with a really sort of horribly abbreviated, but somewhat rapid introduction to some of the things that are going on in the digital humanities. What is it we mean when we talk about digital humanities before I veer off in another direction, which for me personally I find a little bit more productive for thinking about the ways that fields in a large sense are changing rather than the growth of a new field called digital humanities. So in any event, I'm going to start with this background, and then I'll move on to talk about some of the ways in which my own work has encountered the digital and the issues that have been raised for me in the process. Okay, so what is it we're talking about when we talk about this thing called digital humanities? The definition that I tend to fall back on goes something like this. The digital humanities represents a nexus of fields within which scholars use computing technologies to investigate the kinds of questions that are traditional to the humanities, or, as is more true of my own work, in which scholars ask traditional kinds of humanities-oriented questions about computing technologies. Now, so it's a two-sided field in certain ways, and the field periodically feels that divide. Those who are building and using tools in order to do the research, and those who are doing research into the tools, right? On both sides of this definition, though, there's an emphasis on experimentation and on implementing developing knowledge in a hands-on way. Work in digital humanities thus includes a very wide range of digital methodologies, including the development of digital editions and digital corpora for scholarly study, including projects like the William Blake Archive or the Rossetti Archive. Work in digital humanities also includes the development of technical standards to support digital projects like these, such as the Text Encoding Initiative, as well as the development of tools and platforms to support digital humanities projects, such as Omeka, right, which many of you may be familiar with. It facilitates the production of digital exhibitions of various kinds of archival objects. And Neatline, which is actually a plugin for Omeka, which supports the creation of interactive maps and timelines based on those archival objects. And there are projects in the digital humanities, in addition to these, that focus on the creation of large-scale data visualizations, such as photo trails. And then there are rich interactive data mapping projects, including hypercities. Right, now, each of these different modes of work, the visualizations, the mapping, the corpora building, the standards building, the platform building, all of them make clear that digital humanities research outputs often can't be flattened out into journal articles or monographs, but really have to live openly and be used online. And as a result of that, there are also digital humanities projects that are designed to help those scholarly archives and tools become interoperable, and also to facilitate the peer review of non-traditional projects, right, so that they can be reviewed by experts in the field and receive the sorts of acknowledgement and accreditation that they require, including NINES. This is the 19th century networked infrastructure for 19th century electronic scholarship that works to bring together the different corpora and archives of material in the 19th century to review those objects in a very rigorous way, and then to enable those collections to work together. And given this need for robust collaboration and coordination in digital humanities, there are also networks like DH Commons, which are designed to connect scholars in the field with projects and with one another through those projects in order to help them share expertise and learn from one another. And then there are projects like my own Media Commons, which I'll talk a bit more about later, that are focused on creating new modes of scholarly communication and new forms of scholarly community. Now, projects like DH Commons and Media Commons provide, I think, a useful bit of pressure on that definition of the digital humanities. I mean, a network like Media Commons isn't computational per se, right? But rather focuses on using digital networks to facilitate new kinds of humanities scholarship. So, are there limits to this term digital humanities, right? Debates flare up in the field quite frequently about whether one must do X, where X equals write code or build tools or some other form of computational activity in order to be considered doing digital humanities work. Personally, while I often find these debates instructive, I don't necessarily find them particularly helpful in delineating what is and is not digital humanities, in part because I'm not sure that dividing line is necessarily helpful. Bill Cronin, some years back, when he was the incoming president of the American Historical Association, noted in a meeting that I attended that, in fact, the term digital humanities itself may be at the root of the problem, as it seems to indicate that it exists in opposition to some retrograde analog humanities, when, in fact, as he suggested, all of our fields are being affected to greater and lesser extents by the digital. A better concept, he said, might be the humanities in and for the digital age. And this is the term that I've sort of latched onto, as you know from my title. I prefer this concept in a lot of ways because I think it reaches out to all of our fields while permitting a really great diversity in methods, right? Some scholars may work in computation-intensive modes, while others focus on more traditional end results. Now, my work over the last several years has been focused precisely on getting those latter scholars, right, who feel themselves to be most analog, whose modes are served perfectly well by the journal article, by the monograph, and so forth, to understand how it is that they are all already digital, and how the digital is changing their work, whether visibly or invisibly. Now, one of the primary arenas for that change is, of course, in scholarly communication. And given my job title, it's probably not a shock that I would say that. I joined the staff of the Modern Language Association in July 2011 in order to help the association and its members think about the changes that are taking place in publishing across the profession, as scholars increasingly move from a sole focus on the production of books and journal articles to a much more fluid and mobile range of modes of communication. So I want to start out by giving you a bit of the background that explains how I came to these issues before I turn to talk about where it is I think we're headed. Okay, so the short version of the recap. What feels like a very long time ago now, I finished a dissertation that focused on the relationship between the contemporary American novel and television. I was lucky enough to find a tenure-track job, and so I started at that point the process of doing the thing you're supposed to do, right? Turning that dissertation into a book. And as I had been advised, I sent out a bunch of queries to university presses to see who might be interested. There weren't actually that many queries. It just sort of felt like it. And I worked and I waited, and the three presses that I was most interested in all said that they were interested too, and that I should send the full manuscript as soon as it was ready. Now, unfortunately, as soon as it was ready took a little bit longer than I was expecting. Starting a new assistant professorship at a small liberal arts college took a good bit of my focus. And then there's the writing is hard part of the process, right? Turning that dissertation into a book just was not as simple a process as I'd hoped it would be. But it did finally get done, and 3 years after that initial round of queries, I started writing back to the presses that had initially expressed interest, not entirely realizing that the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which had happened in the interim, was going to have an effect here. But it did. Right? The response from all three presses was pretty much the same. This is a great project, but we can't afford to publish it right now. So I scrambled a bit and I sent out some more queries. It starts looking like that pile now. And I got more of the same response. And I finally did get one press that expressed interest, asked to see the manuscript, sent it out to external reviewers, got positive readers' reports, and had an editor that was enthusiastic about the project. But after having held onto it for nearly a year, the press finally declined. The editor had been overruled on the board by the marketing guys who said that the project posed too much financial risk to pursue in the current economy. And I'm sorry to report that that was, in fact, a quote that came in my rejection notice. Now, this particular cause for rejection prompted two immediate responses among the people around me. The first of which was most clearly articulated by my mother, who said they were planning on making money off of your book? Well, the fact is they were, right? Not much, perhaps, but that the press involved needed the book to make money, at least enough to return its costs, and that it doubted that it would, highlights the serious economic problems that scholarly publishing continues to face today. I mean, there's no small irony, though, in the fact that I was facing this situation, as the argument that I was making in this book was precisely that the book is not a dying form, right? And that claims that it is often serve quite conservative ends, shoring up very traditional cultural hierarchies against infiltration by mass culture. And yet here I was, right, left wondering whether the academic book might in fact be facing a kind of death. I mean, one that had less to do with any decline in our need for it than in our ability to support it going forward. Well, as it turned out, after another year and a half of sending out fruitless queries, I finally did find a fabulous press to publish the book with, Vanderbilt. But the whole intervening mess had me wondering whether there might be a better way. I mean, after all, right after I finished the revisions on the manuscript, feeling somewhat impatient about wanting to get some ideas out there now, I started a blog, right? And that blog, which celebrated, oh my goodness, what year is this now? I think it's 11 and a half years old now. helped me develop an audience, right? And a community, in fact, well before any of my traditional publications started drawing any attention. So while the first response to that rejection that I'd received was my mother's somewhat bewildered disbelief, the second response that I started getting was instead about possibilities. As my friend Matt Kirschenbaum asked me in a comment on a blog post that I'd written about the entire debacle, why couldn't I take the manuscript and the positive readers' reports and just publish the whole thing online? Now, he backed down from that possibility in this comment, saying that he understood why it wasn't realistic. But I didn't entirely. I mean, why not start a new kind of online publishing network, one that might learn from the dynamic communities that blogging had created? I mean, why not remake scholarly publishing into something that actually works? Now, if you start thinking that this makes me sound like some sort of naive optimist, you may not entirely be wrong. The connections that I'd found through this early community of academic bloggers really gave me hope. These were supportive colleagues working together in thinking ideas through. And blogging in those early days helped me forge what felt like a little utopian intentional community. And maybe I thought some of the things that I'd found there could be generalized outward. So working with the Institute for the Future of the Book, my co-editor Avi Santo and I founded Media Commons, which became a network in which scholars in media studies could share and discuss their work, develop new collaborations and new projects. Media Commons has been up and running for the better part of 6 years now and has developed a number of projects, including In Media Res, which asks 5 scholars a week to comment briefly on some up-to-the-minute media text as a way of opening discussion about the issues that it presents for media scholars, students, practitioners, and activists. Similarly, The New Everyday is an experiment in middle state publishing, focusing on articles that are more formal than blog posts, yet not quite as fixed as the journal article. Alt Academy remediates the edited volume and journal as a space for lengthier discussion about a particular issue. In fact, there's a new cluster of essays that's about to roll out this week in Alt Academy, which we're really looking forward to. And Media Commons Press is publishing longer texts for open discussion. Now, working on Media Commons has been extremely gratifying, but it's made clear to me how difficult changing a culture can be, right? Getting scholars, administrators, publishers, and institutions to invest their time, effort, and resources in new ways of working really requires, in many cases, changing the ways that they think, right? Changing the things that they prioritize and the ways that they assign value to the products of academic labor. And this kind of change is never easy, particularly given the fundamentally conservative nature of academic institutions. And I mean conservative here in the best possible way, right? That there is a tradition that is worth upholding here. But nonetheless, that conservatism causes change to become very difficult. In the main, we academics are extraordinarily resistant to changes in our ways of working. It's not without reason, I think, that a senior colleague of mine once joked to me that the motto of my former institution, one that I think can usefully be extended to many institutions, could well be, "We have never done it that way before." Or as Donald Hall has put it, scholars often resist applying the critical skills that we bring to our subject matter to an examination of the textuality of our own profession, its scripts, values, biases, and behavioral norms. Now, this kind of self-criticism is admittedly a risky endeavor, right? Those of us who have been privileged enough to succeed within the existing system are often reluctant to bite the hand that feeds us. Changing our technology, changing our ways of doing research, changing our modes of production and distribution of the results of that research, all of these, I think, are crucial to the continued vitality of the academy, and yet none of those changes can possibly come about unless there's first a profound change in the ways of thinking of scholars themselves. Until scholars genuinely believe that publishing on the web is just as valuable as publishing in print, and even more importantly, until they believe that their institutions believe it too. Few are going to be willing to risk their careers on a new way of working, with the result that that new way of working will remain marginal, undervalued, and risky. So what I'm ultimately interested in then is not just the set of technological changes that many believe are necessary to allow academic publishing to flourish into the future, but the social, intellectual, and institutional changes that I think are necessary to pave the way for those new technologies. In order for new modes of communication to become broadly accepted within the academy, scholars and their institutions need to take a new look at the mission of the university, at the goals of scholarly publishing, and the processes through which scholars conduct their work. We need to collectively consider what new technologies have to offer us, not just in terms of reducing the cost of publishing or of increasing access to publications, though these are, of course, enormous issues of great importance, but in terms of how these new technologies will change the ways that we do our research, how they'll change the ways that we write, and how they'll change the ways that we review. And it's the structures of peer review that I argue that we need to begin with, not least because over the course of developing Media Commons and now MLA Commons at the MLA and the dozens of meetings and conferences and panel discussions that I've participated in around those two platforms, every single conversation at some point has come back to the question of peer review. And no wonder. Right? And peer review is extraordinarily important. It is in some sense the sine qua non of the academy. Right? We employ it in almost every aspect of the ways that we work, from hiring decisions through promotion and tenure reviews, in both internal and external grant and fellowship competitions, and of course in publishing. The work that we do as scholars is repeatedly subjected to a set of vetting processes that enable us to indicate that the results of our work have been scrutinized by the authorities in the field and that those results are therefore themselves authoritative. But I also want to point out that the current system of peer review is decidedly imperfect. There is, in fact, a rather extraordinary literature available, mostly in the sciences and social sciences, on the problems with conventional peer review, including its biases and its flaws. In the sciences right now in particular, there's a lot of soul-searching around peer review going on because of some extremely public failures of peer review that have required massive retractions of journal articles in recent days. Now, every scholar, however, I would be willing to bet, has had a more personal experience of some of those flaws than this kind of public retraction. There is, of course, the review that seems to miss the point entirely, the review that must somehow be personally motivated, or perhaps worse, the review that we never even actually get to see. And for such an imperfect system, peer review as we currently conduct it requires an astonishing amount of labor on our part, for which no one can ever really receive credit. And so when my friend Matt Kirschenbaum said in his comment to me that what ought to count is peer review and scholarly merit, not the physical form in which the text is ultimately delivered, I completely agree with him. But at the same time, I feel quite strongly that the system of peer review that we know today could be vastly improved, particularly in a networked environment where projects have to be interacted with in order to be reviewed. And so for that reason, I want to take a closer look at what it is that we mean when we say peer review, what it is we expect peer review to do, and how processes like these might best work for work that is being published online. Now, one of the problems with using our current model of peer review in digital publishing is a fundamental misalignment between the net native means through which authority is determined online and what Mario Biagioli has referred to as the disciplinary technology of peer review, which is a decidedly Foucauldian mode of self-policing that regulates knowledge through discipline. Now, the problem with transferring this disciplinary technology to the networked world is in no small part that the network has its own technologies. The placement of conventional peer review prior to selection for publication in the traditional print-based process indicates that it's meant to serve, at least in part, a gatekeeping function, right? One that allows certain kinds of academic discourse to thrive while excluding other ideas from discussion. Such gatekeeping is arguably necessary in print in order to cope with the scarcities of print's economics, right? Only so many pages in so many books and journals can be published each year. Now, in the digital, however, this kind of scarcity is over. Right? Because anyone can publish anything online, and at least from a perspective that values the free and open communication of the products of scholarly research, not only can but should right? We face instead an extraordinary and overwhelming plenitude. And so what digital scholarly publishing ought to focus on, I think, is not developing a means of applying the current system of peer review to new modes of online work in order to create what you might think of as an artificial scarcity. But instead, we might usefully focus on how we might cope with abundance. Right. As it is, increasing numbers of scholars are self-publishing their work via their blogs, or they're forming new online publishing networks like Media Commons. And in many cases, these kinds of publications are having a greater impact on the scholarly community than their traditional peer-reviewed publications are. It's certainly true in my case, right? All of my first lecture invitations and citations and those other kinds of public recognition that we come to receive as scholars, all of them stemmed not from my journal articles or from my book, which was still years into the future, but from the work that I was doing on my blog. But of course, these new modes of publishing still demand some kind of assessment, right? Even if that assessment comes after the fact. And so it's for this reason that I want to argue that peer review online really needs to include some mode of open post-publication review that doesn't necessarily focus on determining whether something should be published, right? I mean, the stuff is all already out there, but instead measures how it has been and how it should be received, right? What its place in the ecosystem of scholarly communication is, and what kinds of responses it's provoked. Now, a system like this would shift the center of gravity of peer review from regulation to communication, transforming it into a mechanism for facilitating more fluid and productive exchanges amongst peers. And not at all incidentally, a process in which the work of reviewing itself becomes visible as work. Right? And the reviews themselves can become part of the scholarly record. So what I argue in the much longer version of all of this is that we really need to develop a process of peer-to-peer review. Right? One that begins to take advantage of networked publishing's capacity for discussion and dialogue, as well as of what Michael Jensen has called the new metrics of scholarly authority. Now, these new metrics include sort of countable, quantifiable things like hits and downloads, of course, but they also include much more qualitative measures like comments and inbound links, which reveal the ways that web-based texts get used, in order to provide a post-publication mode of beginning to filter the wealth of content that should be made available via networked publishing. After all, scarcity does linger in internet-based communication. There was sort of fudging this when I indicated that scarcity was over earlier. It's just a shift in the location of scarcity, right? Instead of there being a material scarcity around scholarly communication, what has become scarce is time and attention. Right? And so what internet-based scholarly publishing really requires is less gatekeepers deciding what can be published than filters who help you figure out where you should be placing your attention at any given moment. Systems that allow a community of scholars who are working with and responding to one another to set and determine their own standards, to maintain those standards as they see fit, and to guide one another to their determination of the best work being produced in their fields. Now, in order to put my money, at least my metaphorical money, where my mouth was on this issue, I put the entire draft of Planned Obsolescence online for open review. This wasn't a perfect process, but it was an exciting one. I found myself able to discuss the text with colleagues that I cared about at a much earlier stage than I would have been able to otherwise. And I had reviewers sort of discussing the text with one another and often really disagreeing on points of assessment in the text. And I know a lot of things about it now. For instance, I know that in the first 9 months after the project launched, it had over 31,000 page loads. Over 12,000 unique visitors came by for the first time, and over 3,300 of them came back repeatedly. 44 unique commenters left a total of 295 comments. And the project was written about and linked to in more than 20 other venues that I found during this 9-month period, including one review article in a scholarly journal. Right? The thing was still not published yet, and yet, at least in some definitions of published, and yet there was this review. And it was during that same period, it was taught in at least 4 graduate seminars and 1 undergraduate seminar that I know about. And there's part of me that wants to place that list of numbers alongside the fact that the average scholarly press monograph in the humanities currently sells fewer and increasingly fewer than 400 copies over its lifetime. Right? Now, I recognize that numbers aren't everything, but they are still significant, and particularly when coupled with the ability to see the reception of that text in action. Now, as I just suggested in noting that the review came out before the book did, an online review process like this produces some complications, not least for our notion of what publication is and what purposes it serves. And I think there's a reasonable question to be asked about whether the actual publication date of my book ought to be 2009. And when NYU released the revised edition in 2011, that might be thought of as a second edition of sorts. There's also a question to be raised, I think, about the status of the online version of the text now that the print one is out. I've gotten asked several times which is the version of record, and my sort of shrugging response has usually been whichever one you're looking at. And I think there's also some interesting work to be done on thinking about the relationship between the reader's comments on the online version and the ways that their comments wind up incorporated in the final print version of the text. So a broadly implemented system of peer-to-peer review like this would inevitably require us to really think in very different ways about our sense of authorship, what it is we're doing as we write, in no small part because these new modes of review will almost certainly necessitate, I think, a turn from thinking about academic publishing as being a solo endeavor focused on the production and dissemination of individual products, to instead understanding it as being a system that's focused much more broadly on facilitating the processes of scholarly work. I say this not least because the time and effort that are required to maintain a process of peer-to-peer review, such as the one that my book went through, will really require that scholars place some portion of their primary emphasis not on their own individual achievements, but instead on the advancement of the community as a whole, right? And here again, you know, my naive optimist sort of rears its head. This kind of collectivity is obviously a utopian ideal, and to a significant degree it goes against all of our training as scholars, particularly as scholars in the humanities. You know, what we accomplish alone, or at least so it seems to us. You know, we have all sorts of theoretical grounding to claim that this is not so. You know, Roland Barthes told us back in 1967 that no text is a single line of words, but that each is instead a fabric of quotations. You know, we have, in some sense at least, long acknowledged the death of the author, but we haven't thought much about what a proclamation like this, or what the new networks that we're working in today, might mean for our own status as authors. Now, I am not attempting to suggest here that the single author text is going away, or that we're all going to have to get rid of the lines on the CV that are the result of our authorship. Far from it. But I do want us to think about the ways that digital networks, as structures that really facilitate and privilege interaction, communication, and interconnection, are going to ask us to think differently about what it is that we're doing as we write. As the example of the blog might suggest, communities best engage with one another around writing that's open rather than closed, right? That is not definitive, that is still questioning, that's looking forward to, you know, new directions, that's in process in some sense, rather than having been concluded. And I think that new publishing systems that foreground this kind of process, new platforms like Media Commons, like MLA Commons, are likely going to encourage us to think differently about the phases of our work as it has traditionally progressed. We may be encouraged to publish for whatever set of ideas that means now, to publish work earlier in its development, right, at the conference paper stage perhaps, and to remain engaged with things that we would ordinarily have thought of as finished much longer than we traditionally have. Now, admittedly, this makes many scholars nervous, both about letting the messiness of our processes be seen. You know, we don't tend to put the rough work out there before we have to. But also on the other end, it makes scholars nervous about the prospect of never really being fully done with something, right? Expecting that it's going to continue developing. And there's good reason to be nervous about these things. There's been a lot of work that's been done in digital humanities recently about how to call a halt to a project, precisely because of this problem. There comes a point at which the scholar definitely needs to walk away. But on the other hand, if we think about, particularly with these more traditional modes of writing and engaging with an audience, about what it is we're trying to accomplish in that process, to the degree that scholarship is really about engaging in an exchange of ideas with one's peers. These new sorts of open-ended, networked publishing structures can really facilitate that interaction, but will best do so if we're able to allow that discussion to remain open-ended and then sort of fade into the past as needed. Now, this foregrounding of process over product, however, I think is going to require authors to be prepared to relinquish a certain degree of control over their texts and of what becomes of them. First of all, letting go of the illusion that their work springs wholly from the individual intelligence, right? And acknowledging the ways that scholarship, even in those fields in which sole authorship has long been the norm, has nonetheless always been a collaborative process, right? We have always been in conversation with our predecessors and speaking with the folks who will follow us. It has always been thus. It's now we're able to see that conversational structure precisely because of the ways that the web intensifies these collaborative relationships, allowing other readers and our predecessors even to argue back within the same frame as our texts. Now, sometimes these new sorts of collaborative technologies may produce literally new co-authoring relationships, but not necessarily always. Nonetheless, I do think that we're going to need to develop a set of much more robust citational practices that acknowledge the participation of our peers in the development of our work. This is one of the things that I found that was an outgrowth of the open peer review process, was recognizing how many ideas I had for the development of the text that came from the comments in that discussion, and knowing that they needed to be cited, in no small part because there is a record of where those ideas came from. In the past, peer review processes being closed, brilliant ideas can come to you from an anonymous peer reviewer, and other than that one initial footnote thanking the anonymous reviewers, there really isn't a way to acknowledge the origin of that idea and to really engage with that reviewer as a scholar. Right? So open review processes, I think, are going to require us to be a bit more open about where those ideas have originated from and how our work has developed in that collaborative relationship with our peers. I would also suggest that we're going to need to think differently about things like originality in scholarly production, recognizing that in a networked environment in which there is an explosion of discourse constantly being made available, some of the most important work that we do as scholars may more closely resemble contemporary editorial practices or even curatorial practices, bringing together and highlighting and remixing significant ideas in other texts rather than necessarily producing our own new original text. But the catch, of course, is that we have to find ways for these new modes of authorship, modes that are process-centered, that are collaborative, that are remix-oriented, to count within our current systems of evaluation. Now, there are lots of other such changes that will be required, I think, throughout the entire academic community if these new publishing practices are to take root. Publishers are going to need to think differently about their business models, which may need to focus more on services and less on objects, about their editorial practices, which I think are going to require a greater investment in helping projects develop from a much earlier phase, and about the structures of texts, which will probably become less linear and which will undoubtedly become less uniformly textual. They'll also need to think in concert with libraries about archival and preservation practices, ensuring that the texts that are being produced today remain available and accessible tomorrow. And universities in the broadest sense will need to rethink the relationship between the library, the university press, the Information Technology Center, and the academic units within the institution, really reimagining the funding model under which publishing operates and remembering the institutional purposes that such publishing was invented to serve. But also, and really crucially, reimagining the relationship between the academic institution and the surrounding culture. As these new networked systems of knowledge production become increasingly prevalent and influential, the university and the scholars who comprise it really need to find ways to adapt these systems to our needs, or we run the risk of becoming increasingly irrelevant to the ways that contemporary culture produces and communicates authority. Okay, so all of this is explored in much greater length at Planned Obsolescence, which, as I said, did come out in 2011. But just as I was finishing this thing up, I had this extremely strange experience in which somebody kind of came up to me and said, hey, these are some really interesting ideas you've got here. Let's find out if they work. So the Office of Scholarly Communication at the MLA was established by the Executive Council and charged with bringing together and reimagining our existing book publishing program and our web editorial functions. The new structure is meant to grapple with the growing understanding that scholarly communication, in this sense that's much broader than publishing per se, is the very foundation of what scholarly societies do, right? It's their very purpose since the Royal Society of London. So given that the new office touches every part of the organization, from member relations to the convention and much more, the office has two primary responsibilities, one of which is to think about the future of our book publications program as these books become themselves increasingly digital. And the second is to think about the born digital platforms for the new kinds of communication in which our members will want to engage and will need us to support in order to facilitate their developing scholarly practices. The relatively easy part of the first area involves thinking about how our print projects will best circulate as ebooks, right? As well as taking projects that have to this point existed only in print and thinking about how the digital might enable new and better kinds of interaction with them. Along that lines, we're currently conducting our second round of the New Variorum Shakespeare Digital Challenge, in which we've released the XML from two of our recent volumes of the Variorum under a Creative Commons license, and are encouraging scholars to download it and to see what they can do with it, to create the most exciting interface or API or visualization or mashup that they can, to let us see something of where the future of the Variorum may lie. Now, there's a lot more to be figured out on this end of our charge, of course. There are enormous questions about sustainable business models and open access, but at least we sort of know what those questions are. The other half of our charge is a good bit more complicated and a good bit more fuzzy. Not only are these born digital platforms themselves always in development, they're sort of a moving target. Their adoption really requires, I think, a new perspective on the function of the scholarly society in the digital age. It's possible, for instance, that the locus of value of the scholarly society is shifting from providing members with closed access to the products of the society to instead facilitating the broadly open distribution of the work that's being done by its members. Now, this is a massive change, right? One, from a situation in which you join a society in order to receive its journal and go to its convention, to instead one in which you join in order to get your work out to the world. We've started thinking about this born digital platform and how it might help create new kinds of relationships with and among our members by building MLA Commons, which is a platform that we launched a year ago at our convention in Boston. MLA Commons is designed to support a very wide range of forms of member-to-member communication, collaboration, feedback, and publishing. And we're extremely grateful to have received a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support this work. We're also benefiting from the pretty extraordinary generosity of the CUNY Academic Commons team, who are in turn supported by the Sloan Foundation, in generalizing the model that they built for our use. The CUNY Academic Commons is a sort of robust platform for communication that links faculty and graduate students on all of the CUNY campuses scattered all over the city of New York. They've now developed that platform into what they call the Commons in a Box, for which the MLA was one of the first major partners. The Commons software is entirely open source, and so is available online to be downloaded. Its base platform is the popular blog engine WordPress, which has become something of an industry standard, running with the social network plugin BuddyPress and a host of other associated plugins. And the Commons team has its eye on thinking about what its coordination of all of this software might give back to those developer communities. And similarly, we at the MLA have the long-term goal of generalizing the model that we're developing. And so we're in conversation with a number of other scholarly societies right now, thinking about how we might together build a federated commons of commonses that would allow our many different members to overlap and interact as seems desirable. So any member of the MLA can currently activate their account on the Commons, and with that account, they can create a profile. The profile allows them to join discussion groups, to publish an individual blog or a group blog, to post and share documents, to work collaboratively on projects, and a number of other things besides. Groups on the Commons can be open or closed membership. They can do their work openly or in private. And in this way, the groups on the Commons can support both the work of MLA committees and of the divisions and discussion groups that already exist within the association, but also of ad hoc groups of scholars who can come together around particular kinds of projects. And this, in particular, I think is going to help us facilitate a transformation of the association into a much more fluid structure, as groups will be able to sort of form, reform, and fade away as needed. Blogs at MLA Commons are open outlets on which individual members or groups of members are able to share their work and communicate with a range of broader publics. And the site provides a bunch of other ways for members to connect and communicate with one another as well. So we're hoping and beginning to see, after a year now, that it's actually coming to fruition, that there's going to be lots of unfiltered, open content that gets produced through the network. But we're also thinking about the future of the Commons as a formal publication platform as well. And so we've developed a set of workflows that are enabling groups to implement whatever kinds of editorial filtering they wish to engage in. If, for instance, they want to create a meta blog of sorts that highlights and aggregates the best stuff that's going on in their subfield for their members. In this line, we've also released a couple of formal publications. First, what we're thinking of as an evolving anthology, Literary Studies in the Digital Age, which, unlike an edited print volume, we're going to be able to allow to grow and change over time. And again, we're hoping that our divisions and discussion groups begin to serve a sort of editorial function, that they take on the responsibility for doing that filtering for their members of the work that's going on here. And this might be, we hope, the seeds of the kind of post-publication peer review system for this openly published work that gets posted through MLA Commons, giving the authors of this new kind of work the recognition that they require. Through new modes of publication such as this, we're explicitly thinking about how MLA Commons might be a way that scholarly societies can help further the goals of open access, really furthering the value that they provide to their members by helping them get their work out to the world, where it can have the greatest possible benefit and produce the greatest possible interest in the research that's being done in the humanities. But given my continued belief that the primary problem that really needs to be solved in scholarly communication today is less a technical problem than a social one, we still have a number of key challenges ahead of us. Most particularly, I think we need to keep our focus on how we can continue to create buy-in amongst the membership for using the platform. We've had a certain degree of success. We've got about 12% of the members of the MLA in the system now, and getting 12% of the members of the MLA to do anything is a success. But nonetheless, other scholarly societies have attempted to roll out platforms for member communication only to discover that if you build it, they will not necessarily come, right? Users face profile fatigue, and those that are most likely to adopt these new modes of communication, in fact, often already have their needs met by their own existing channels. So we're trying to think of MLA Commons as part of an extended experiment, right? One that will allow us to gather information about what our members do and don't need, and how we might encourage them to create exciting new forms of content by demonstrating for them what the platform can do and by pushing at its edges. So we're talking a lot about how we can get members to come build the kind of community that I found in my early blogging days. And my sense is really that the platform will come of age at the moment when somebody does something in the network that we utterly did not expect. In the end, I think it's that space of possibility, right? The space for the unexpected, of open exchange, of genuine communication that I think might be the key to the future of the humanities. We hope over the course of the next year to continue expanding that space of possibility. As I mentioned, we're in conversation with other scholarly societies about developing a federated interdisciplinary humanities commons that would allow for exchange across society lines. And I think that this, in the end, I mean, really is the key to the humanities in and for the digital age, is recognizing that at the root of everything we do as scholars of the humanities, that root has always less been about producing certain kinds of objects than it has been about a broader sense of the processes of communication, right? Working with our colleagues in ways that facilitate the development of new knowledge across our fields. Even more, even when they've been produced and consumed in relative isolation, these forms of communication that we have engaged in have always been fundamentally social. Connecting scholars in a wide variety of relationships. As our means of communication become increasingly technologized, we have a tendency to assume that we face a set of problems with technological solutions. But I would argue that the challenges that face the humanities today have, as they have always had, overwhelmingly social solutions. And it's my hope that working together, scholars, librarians, technologists, publishers, societies, and administrators can all collectively do something that none of us can do alone, which is to build a dynamic, engaging, sustainable humanities that is genuinely of and for the digital age. So thank you again for having me here.
So one of your comments is a perfect lead-in to opening up questions, because you, at one point in your talk, said that technology was really terrific for facilitating communication. This room, a different form of technology, is also terrific for facilitating face-to-face communication, since you came to be with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming, Kathleen.
Oh, my pleasure.
You have taken us literally from the beginning to where we are today in about an hour, as you worked your way through all of this. And I invite my colleagues to pummel you with questions.
Excellent. Bring on the pummeling. Nami.
You have, as always, a cascade of fascinating ideas, and a particular bravo for what you're doing at the MLA.
Thank you.
I think a lot about what the sciences have done as social communities, because I think you're entirely right that the issue is more social than technological, of such things as working in labs with groups of people, such things as putting out pre-publication stuff to a lot of colleagues and getting comments before things are published. I think about the Public Library of Science, which was a terrific endeavor that also has lots of good grant money to make it work.
Indeed.
And what I'm wondering is what we can learn in the humanities about what's worked in the sciences to do the sorts of things that have been so successful there. So I think about the fact that many of us who publish, whether it's going to be an article, whether it's going to be a book, intentionally send our stuff out to colleagues, including those we know disagree with us, so that we will hear it first from friends rather than from reviewers or, either when you send something in for publication or when something has already come out.
Right.
So we've already gotten that news. Thus, we already have something of a model for those of us who largely work independently of getting a community formed before something is published. Technology obviously will make that an easier thing to do. So my question is there a way of not exactly cloning, but building upon what we do as individuals anyway and what the sciences have done for years
Yes.
in transforming humanities?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of things that we can learn from the sciences and that we can build on our own practices, make sure that our own values in communication remain at the center of what it is that we're doing. Thinking about the writing group idea that you were discussing, you send your work out to a select number of colleagues to get response. One of the things that we're hoping develops on MLA Commons is exactly that kind of exchange among defined clusters of scholars who are working with one another for whatever reason. The group structure in MLA Commons has a number of different variations, right? As I mentioned, there are open groups that anybody can join that do all their work in public. There are private groups where you have to request membership and the work is not visible to anyone who is not a member. In addition to that, there's a third kind, that's the hidden group, that it functions just like a private group, except it doesn't appear in any of the lists of all the groups that are out there. And so it's literally by invitation only. We're hoping that scholars will use that hidden group functionality to take the writing groups that they already have in place online and to develop more fluid ways of exchanging their material with one another. But thinking about the sciences and the ways that they've handled this. So arXiv, with an X, the preprint server that was originally founded at Los Alamos is a way for high-energy physicists to get their preprints into distribution with one another more quickly. I mean, there it was all about speed, right? Because the publishing process took too long, and there was always anxiety on the parts of the scholars that somebody else was going to be able to publish the discovery first, right? So if you can get your preprint out there and get it date stamped, you can lay claim to. Well, we don't have quite those anxieties about speed in that same way, but nonetheless, the ability to get that work out to colleagues more quickly facilitated a kind of support for the work and a kind of interest in the work that was self-sustaining in a way that produced more enthusiasm and more energy. And in certain fields, now, the folks who post things on arXiv go on to publish them in traditional peer-reviewed journals. But there are fields in which arXiv has become the publication of record, right? And that is now the version that you cite. So it's an informal network. It grew by itself. It requires a lot of energy, and on the part of Cornell, a lot of investment now in order to keep it going. But it's a really vibrant community that I think we in the humanities can learn a lot from. The other thing from the sciences that I would really love for us to learn from a bit more is the lab-based structure as a way of bringing early career scholars into the profession and working in a collaborative form from a very early phase of one's career, rather than, what happens with us in the humanities right now, you come in and in your freshman comp class, you're asked to exchange papers and work collaboratively, and then that all stops at a certain point, and you're sort of sent off into your own library carrel, and we work alone after that. If we could keep that mode of collaboration, of working with one another in the entire educational process, rather than sort of ending it and sending people off to do independent projects, I think we might see a different mode of working together in later career phases. There's a very interesting program for this kind, or model for this kind of work in the humanities that's in place in Germany right now. The DFG, the sort of German funding body for higher education, has way more money than the NEH does, by a really, an order of magnitude. But they fund what they refer to with the unfortunate term clusters of excellence. But these are basically clusters of faculty at a range of career stages and PhD students who come together around a particular topic and propose that topic as if it were going to be a lab for X number of years. So I got to see one of these groups function at the University of Göttingen. There was a cluster on popular seriality. And there were, 5 faculty members who were working on things from comic books to television serials to all of the different ways in which we publish and communicate in serial form in contemporary American culture. who then advertised for postdocs and PhD studentships. And the PhD students came into that research cluster knowing at the outset that this was the work that they were going to be doing, right? It was very much the lab model in which the faculty set the agenda for what happened in the lab, and the PhD students were working in that lab, but toward eventually their own independent projects and their PhDs. And it would be really exciting to think about how a model like that might function in PhD granting institutions in the US in the humanities. And what would it be for a cluster of faculty to come together around an idea and say, now we're going to take on 5 graduate students who want to work on this with us? So something else to learn from the sciences, I think. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I hope I haven't pummeled questions out of you. Yes?
When we write the most traditional article, it's always collaborative in the sense that we've got an imagined, real or virtual audience in mind. We're always wondering what will he or she think of what I'm writing. So, I mean, in a way, there's nothing really new about the collaboration idea.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I really do hope to get across is that what might sound like radical changes when I first present them are really not all that radical. They're sort of facilitating the values that we already have in our work, right? That we've always been in dialogue with the work that's gone before us. We might just be able to have that conversation a little more literally as a conversation now, without the sort of stretch of years between. On the other hand, this doesn't mean at all that everything has to happen with the speed of conversation, right? There's still a value in taking time to ponder an idea and to think through it carefully and then to return to that conversation. And I think that one of the benefits of the digital is that it can facilitate both the sort of greater immediacy of conversation with one's peers and also the ability to return to a conversation later on and to sort of revive a conversation in later days. So yes, I think absolutely that this is not as different from the ways that we have worked as it may at first seem. Yes.
Would you comment a little bit more on the filter function? You talked about the new scarcity being time and attention. And one of the incredible challenges is just to know what to look at and
Right.
how to use your time on a day-to-day basis. Could you just elaborate?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that problem of time and attention is less new than it may seem to us already. I mean, right now. I mean, it feels like this constant barrage, and yet if you look back at, C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures essay, if you look at Vannevar Bush's As We May Think, both of them were already dealing with the question of information overflow and how it is we can possibly figure out what's important to us when there's just too much material out there. But I think what the digital provides for us is a means of rethinking the nature of imprimatur, basically, the thing that lets us know that something is worth our time and attention. Conventionally, in traditional publishing, this happens when an article comes out from a journal and we trust the journal, or a manuscript comes out from a press and we trust the press. The seal on the spine of the book that says that it's out from this press lets us know that it's part of a line of other books that are in a field that we've been interested in, and so probably this one will be important too. And also an editor and a couple of peer reviewers have determined that this is worth our time. Similarly, a journal article, we know who the editors are, who the editorial board is. We trust them on some level to make those judgments for us. As we move to the filter function from that gatekeeping function, the point of establishment of that imprimatur shifts from the moment of publication, because anybody, as we know, can publish anything on the internet. It can come from anywhere. We don't have that same marker of trust in the venue that we've had in the past. What we have instead is an imprimatur that arises from the moment of reception, from the moment of community. The vast majority of stuff that I actually bother to take the time to read online anymore is stuff that somebody I know has recommended to me, whether it came to me via Twitter or, God forbid, Facebook, or wherever. Someone on the internet said to me, "Hey, Kathleen, I think you ought to read this," and for whatever reason, I trust their judgment on this issue. And so it's a similar form of placing my trust in someone else's judgment. It's just that judgment is coming at reception instead of at publication. And so I think the filtering function is very much like the early days of blogging, right? Blogging comes out of guys with a lot of time on their hands who spent a lot of time on the internet, finding neat things and writing little blurbs about those neat things for an audience that was following them. And I think more and more we're going to need that in a scholarly sense. We're going to need somebody who is a 19th century Americanist, who is constantly paying attention to what's going on in the field and who is gathering together links and bringing them to the attention of other people who are following them and saying, oh, these are the interesting things that are happening. And that those links, I was linked by this very important blogger in the field of 19th century American studies, is going to be something that we can point to as one of those markers of impact going forward. I hope that helps. Thanks. So in the back, you were, yeah.
I have about 3 questions that I'll try to ask you all at once. The first is about the anonymous quality of peer review, as most of it is conducted today. And the value of having that. I reviewed 4 or 5 articles for peer review journal last year. And when someone's work was obviously not meeting a certain standard or contributing new knowledge to the field, it was possible to tell them very kindly and to share some suggestions about how they might improve their product, with that, knowing that I wouldn't come face to face with them at this conference, or I might, but they wouldn't. So I'm interested in what happens there. Secondly, it seems to me that while we'd like to think of the academy and the scholarly community as a very humane and kindly group of people, it's going to be increasingly possible to manipulate responses. Just asking your friends to say the sheer number of comments on an article. So I'm interested in that issue of manipulation. As much as I like the direction we're going in, I'm interested in solving some of the problems.
Absolutely.
And then the third question is around expectations for undergraduates, both more sophisticated, say seniors writing a thesis, or less sophisticated. And taking just literature in the MLA as an example, we make progress when we get them to use the MLA bibliography for a database. Now there is, and has been for a long time, but increasingly so, these commons where the latest, most important conversations in some cases are taking place. And what expectations can we have for undergraduate research in that kind of environment?
Oh boy, big question. Okay, so I'm going to take those in order, and I'll attempt to be brief. On anonymity, I do want to say that I still believe that there is a time and a place for anonymity, particularly in situations in which there is a hierarchical difference between the reviewer and the reviewee, where someone at an early career stage is being asked to review the work of someone much senior. I think there is a time and a place for that kind of protection of the identity of the person who is raising critical problems. So I will say that up front. I'm now going to kind of completely undercut that by saying that I also believe that there are a vast number of abuses of anonymity that have taken place traditionally through the peer review process. And there's part of me that really wants to ask us, particularly those of us who are in safe positions, right, who aren't under threat, whether because of the dangerous nature of our work or because of the hierarchical inequity within which we're working, to sort of be brave enough to take responsibility for the things that we are saying to one another, right? To find a way to conduct that critical review as we would face to face, right? To sort of disagree and to not, have to have a happy consensus, but to do so in a way that encourages development of ideas in a positive fashion. I don't want to be overly utopian about this. I have seen radical failures of civility in recent days on the internet, and so I recognize that this is a serious issue, and that anonymity has its purposes. But I also think it can be really dangerous. And so thinking about ways that we can balance these things, thinking about how we can create enough trust with one another to be willing to sign our critical reviews, and yet to know that we're protected when we need to be, is going to be a key problem to solve. And I do not claim to have an answer. Similarly, on gaming the system, every system can be gamed. If you develop a new system, somebody's going to figure out how to game it. The one difference, I think, in these open processes for gaming the system is that the gaming also becomes visible, right? Right now, I was in like my first or second year at Pomona, and I had just gotten back from a very top tier, well-respected journal in my field, a rejected article. And I'm standing in the mailroom somewhat dejectedly, and a colleague of mine, senior colleague, came in and said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I just got another journal or another article rejected by name of journal here." And he looked at me and said, "Why on earth would you even submit your stuff there? You didn't go to the University of Chicago." And I thought, wait, what? And I went and looked, and lo but, it was a real University of Chicago organ. As people had sort of spread out throughout the profession, they all had ties back there. And I thought, who knew, right? Online, at least, those kinds of in-group focuses and ways of saying, interestingly, it's only all his friends that are commenting on this piece, become visible. And so at least we have a way of sort of being critical of the process in addition to of the object itself. Finally, expanding, demands on undergraduates. This is an enormous question, and I have no earthly idea. I think, it's increasingly important for us to focus on making sure that our undergraduates are as information literate as possible, which is to say that they recognize where the stuff they're reading is coming from and not just what it is. But we need to help them in that process, right? By creating these new modes of authorizing information and of suggesting that these are the things that undergraduates ought to be paying attention to. You mentioned the MLA, International Bibliography. The bibliography is now indexing scholarly web resources. I hope that we'll be able to expand that over the coming years so that more and more of the kinds of information that's being published openly on the internet is also findable through trusted scholarly sources. So.